Hi, welcome to History Talks. I'm your host, Will. This is Sebastian. In this episode, we continue our series on ancient Rome, and we will be discussing what happened after the civil war that followed Caesar's assassination. So, Sebastian, tell us what happened.
After the end of the Civil War, the three triumvirs, Octavian, Marc Antony, and Lepidus, split up the empire into zones controlled by each respective triumvir. Officially, Italy was mutually controlled by all. Marc Antony got Eastern Europe and Anatolia, Octavian got Gaul and northern Italy, and Lepidus got Iberia and North Africa. However, Lepidus, being the least powerful of the three, was accused of traitorous negotiations with an enemy and lost Hispania to Octavian, while Marc Antony took control of Sirte, which is near Egypt. Now, this enemy was Sextus Pompey, who was Pompey the Great's third son and his most avid supporter. Sextus had taken control of Sicily during the previous civil war and rallied supporters of the late general to fortify Sicily, which he used as a base to pirate ships from the triumvirs and take control of Sardinia.
It sounds like there was quite a bit of unrest and uncertainty about the fate of the Roman Republic.
Yes. Octavian attempted to kick them out of Sicily with military force. However, his assault was repelled by the rather large force of Sextus Pompey, causing Octavian to sign a peace treaty called the Pact of Misneum, which guaranteed Pompeian control of Sicily in exchange for an end to the piracy. Octavian, just a year later, accused Sextus of violating the treaty by raiding Italian towns and restarted the war. This time, he gave control of the fleet to a lieutenant named Agrippa, who quickly turned the tides and eventually captured Sextus, who was promptly executed without trial.
Wow. Do you think Sextus really broke the treaty, or did Octavian just need an excuse to wage war?
As far as I'm aware, there isn't a lot of evidence for either side. With this victory, Octavian's forces and his control became more consolidated, and he eventually went as far as declaring himself Dei Filius, or son of a god.
Wow.
Tensions in Rome were still rising, even when Lepidus was outright kicked out of the triumvirate in 36 BC, and his lands and legions were seized by Octavian. Marc Antony and Octavian were such clashing personalities that they simply could not be co-rulers in a stable government. Something had to give.
Do you think that clash was because while Antony was willing to take orders from Caesar, he thought that the younger Octavian should be taking orders from him?
Yes, in fact, he viewed himself as the rightful heir to Caesar. Now, Marc Antony had fallen in love with Cleopatra, in the process cheating on his wife Octavia, who was Octavian's sister. And Antony was spending an increased amount of his time in Egypt, all of which Octavian pressed on to attack Antony, trying to convince the Senate that Egypt was where Antony's true loyalties lie, and not Rome. Octavian had also been increasing his support with the people more directly by donating large portions of his properties to be turned into public works.
So he was a populist like Caesar.
Yes. Marc Antony had still been hanging on to a fair amount of public support, added to by a successful military campaign in Parthia. However, all of this changed with the donations of Alexandria. This was a restructuring of the eastern provinces that amounted to giving significant portions of the land in the east to Cleopatra and her sons as noble titles. And then he sent a letter to Rome asking for recognition of these grants by the Senate.
That does sound like someone whose loyalties lie with Egypt.
Yes. And this confirmed every fear that Octavian had been trying to instill in the Senate, in addition to scaring the populace into thinking Antony was trying to become a king, which was all Octavian needed to get the Senate to consider Antony a traitor and to declare war on Cleopatra. Now, some, especially those at the time, viewed the donations of Alexandria as Antony being blinded by his love for Cleopatra, to the point where it made him not just tone-deaf, but ultimately self-detrimental. Some historians nowadays, however, argue that there was some rationality behind this move, that it directly revoked any claims Octavian might have had to the east and goaded him into a war that Antony felt he had the resources and strategic might to win.
What do you think? Was Antony thinking strategically, Or was he acting under the influence of Cleopatra?
Well, I do understand the argument that between his army that just defeated Parthia and Cleopatra's resources, that he may have felt he had a chance against Octavian. Alienating the Senate is still such a unfathomably dumb move that I think that he was blinded by his love.
I think so too.
This began yet another Roman civil war, which is often known either as the War of Actium or the last war of the Roman Republic. Now, Antony's first move was to sail his army to Actium, which is located on the west coast of Greece, at which Octavian met his army with Antony's, and while all of this was happening, Octavian's lieutenant Agrippa, who you may remember from the campaign against Sextus Pompey, captured a city south of Actium called Methone. Now, Actium is located at a strait leading into the Ambracian Gulf, and the two armies were located on either side of the strait. At first, they preferred to make it a battle of attrition, wearing each other down with skirmishes. This state of affairs ended up greatly benefiting Octavian, as Antony lost far more men in these skirmishes and ended up having a number of defectors and deserters.
What gave Octavian the upper hand in this battle of attrition? Was it better ground or better tactics?
The key thing was better troops. A lot of his troops were actually veterans from Caesar's campaign, not to mention troops that were more experienced from the campaign against Sextus. Now, Antony realized the situation he was in, and he had his fleet, which was led by Cleopatra, sent into Actium to try to break Octavian's navy, which had less ships. And this battle was decisive, hence the war being named for it. Octavian won it, by the way, thanks in part to the fact that one of Antony's generals defected and warned Octavian of Antony's battle plan, which was to concentrate heavy ships on the flank led by Agrippa.
Wow. Why do you think Antony's general defected? Was it because he questioned Antony's loyalty to Rome?
But mainly he had less faith that Antony could even win the war.
Huh.
Now, Antony's ships were evaded by Agrippa's and frustrated into a direct center charge, at which point they were encircled and completely destroyed. Antony fled without most of his army, which probably surrendered as soon as Antony escaped. Antony instead turned to an ally in the east named Lucius Pinarius for a fresh batch of troops, a request that was denied because said ally had switched allegiances to Octavian, who then ordered Lucius to besiege Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, and the city Antony had escaped to.
Sounds like Antony had been defeated. Did he surrender at this point?
Well, Antony made one last desperate attack against his besiegers to try to break out of the city, but his army was slaughtered by Lucius's, which outnumbered Antony 2-1 and was the final nail in the coffin. Antony committed suicide by falling on his sword. Cleopatra attempted to offer herself as a prisoner to Octavian in exchange for Caesarion's life, but Octavian informed her that 2 Caesars are too many. Seeing she was out of options and knowing she was likely going to be humiliated at a triumph and then executed, Cleopatra ultimately chose to commit suicide by poisoning, some accounts saying she more specifically used a venomous snake.
What do you think would have happened to Antony if he had surrendered rather than taken his own life?
Given he was considered a traitor against Rome in favor of Egypt, he would have likely been treated the same that Cleopatra feared. After the war, Octavian had the Egyptians declare him pharaoh, and he took Egypt as his personal property, but then he returned almost immediately to Rome, where the Senate named him Augustus, which means something along the lines of Your Majesty or the Great. More importantly, they granted him unprecedented power under the now permanent title of Commander, which in Latin is Imperator, the origin of the modern English Emperor.
And that is how the Roman Republic ended. But that is not the end of our series on ancient Rome. We'll see you in the next episode.